Why would an entire city be built in one of the coldest, darkest, and most isolated places on Earth, only to be abandoned almost overnight, far above the Arctic Circle, where winter lasts most of the year, and the sun disappears for months? There is a place that feels less like a ruin and more like a paused moment in history. This is Pyramid, a ghost town that does not look destroyed, burned, or slowly eroded by time. It looks interrupted. Pyramiden sits on the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard, surrounded by glaciers, mountains, and endless Arctic silence. The air is sharp, the ground frozen solid, and the landscape feels hostile to human life. Yet here, in this extreme environment, rows of Soviet-style apartment blocks still stand. A cultural center with a grand theater remains intact. A school, a library, a sports hall, and even a swimming pool still exist. Inside many buildings, furniture is still in place. Books remain on shelves. Shoes sit by doors. It feels as if people simply stood up one day, walked out, and never returned. That is what makes Pyramiden so unsettling. Most abandoned cities show decay, vandalism, or clear signs of disaster. Pyramiden does not. It feels preserved, almost deliberately. The clocks stopped. The calendar pages never turned. The town is silent, but not empty in the way ruins usually are. It is empty in a way that suggests planning, control, and something carefully managed. To reach Pyramiden, even today, is difficult. There are no roads connecting it to the outside world. In summer, it can only be accessed by boat through icy waters. In winter, by snowmobile across frozen terrain, always under the threat of polar bears. This isolation raises an immediate question. Why was a full city ever built here in the first place? No ordinary settlement would choose such a location. Pyramiden was never meant to grow naturally. It was placed here for a reason. Originally founded by Sweden in 1910 and later sold to the Soviet Union, Pyramiden became one of the northernmost permanent settlements in the world. But it was not just a mining town. It was something more ambitious. The Soviets turned it into a showcase, a model Arctic city designed to prove that socialism could create not just survival, but comfort, culture, and even happiness in the most extreme conditions on Earth. At its peak, more than 1,000 people lived here. Families, children, teachers, doctors, miners, artists. They had heated apartments, fresh food flown in regularly, schools, music, cinema, and sports. Life expectancy in Pyramiden was reportedly higher than in many parts of the Soviet Union. On paper, it was a success story, a frozen utopia. But utopias rarely collapse quietly, and yet that is exactly what seems to have happened here. Walking through Pyramiden today, visitors describe an overwhelming feeling of presence without people. The bust of Lenin still stands in the town square, staring out over empty streets. Inside the cultural center, posters from the 1980s still hang on the walls. In the gymnasium, basketballs lie deflated on the floor. In apartments, children's drawings remain pinned to walls. There are no signs of panic, no smashed windows, no graffiti, no evidence of violence. This absence of chaos is disturbing. It suggests evacuation was orderly, controlled, planned, but planned for what? And why did it happen so fast? Officially, Pyramiden was abandoned in 1998 due to economic reasons. Coal mining was no longer profitable after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Maintaining a remote Arctic settlement became too expensive. That explanation sounds logical. Too logical, because cities rarely empty this quickly, without leaving behind more evidence of struggle, resistance, or gradual decline. And then there are the details that do not fit neatly into the official story. Why leave behind so much personal property? Why abandon infrastructure that was still functional? Why did some residents reportedly receive only days of notice before leaving? And why has so much of the town been left untouched for decades, as if someone wanted it to remain exactly as it was? Pyramiden feels less like a town that failed and more like a place that was deliberately shut down, as if a switch was flipped. One moment, life continued as normal in the Arctic night. The next, the city became a frozen echo, standing there, surrounded by mountains and ice, with no sound except the wind. A deeper question begins to form. Was Pyramiden simply an economic casualty of a collapsing empire? Or was it part of something larger, something tied to politics, secrecy, and decisions made far away from this frozen valley? Because cities do not usually vanish without leaving scars. And Pyramiden's greatest mystery is not that it is abandoned, it is how cleanly it was erased from human life, while everything else was left behind, waiting. If this story already made you uneasy, pause for a moment and think about what you are really witnessing here. Pyramiden is not just an abandoned town. It is a decision frozen in time. And understanding why places like this exist and why they are erased so quietly is the key to understanding how power, ideology, and human lives intersect in extreme moments of history. If you are watching this and forming your own theory about what really happened in Pyramiden, leave a comment below. Was this only an economic collapse, or do you believe there is more hidden beneath the official explanation? Your perspective matters, and reading your thoughts helps uncover angles that are often ignored. And if you are finding value in this deep investigation, make sure to leave a like. It tells the platform that this kind of detailed, research-driven storytelling deserves to reach more people. If you want more stories about abandoned cities, forgotten places, and historical mysteries that were never fully explained, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what comes next. Pyramiden was never meant to be just a place to extract coal. From the moment the Soviet Union took control of it in the late 1920s, the town became something far more symbolic. This was an experiment placed deliberately at the edge of the habitable world, a statement carved into ice and rock. The message was simple and bold. If socialism could work here, it could work anywhere. The location alone tells you this was not an ordinary decision. Svalbard sits deep inside the Arctic Circle, a land of permafrost, violent storms, and months of complete darkness. Building anything here required enormous effort. Supplying it required even more. Every piece of food, fuel, machinery, and medicine had to be transported across frozen seas. Nothing about Pyramiden was convenient. That inconvenience was the point. For Soviet planners, Pyramiden was proof of capability. The USSR had acquired mining rights on Svalbard through international treaties, but instead of running the town like a minimal industrial outpost, they transformed it into a showcase. Wide streets were laid out. Apartment blocks were designed to be warm, bright, and comfortable. Cultural institutions were prioritized alongside industry. This was ideological architecture. Unlike many Soviet mining towns, Pyramiden was carefully curated. Workers were selected, not just assigned. Residents were often considered elite laborers, rewarded with better living conditions than those found in much of the Soviet Union. Salaries were higher. Food quality was better. Fresh produce was flown in regularly, an absurd luxury in the Arctic. Children attended well-funded schools. Adults had access to music, theater, sports, and education. This was no accident. Pyramiden functioned as propaganda in physical form. Visiting delegations were meant to see smiling families, clean apartments, full shelves, and cultural life thriving under red banners, while glaciers loomed outside. The town existed to contradict Western narratives about Soviet hardship. It said, "Look what we can build, even here." The coal itself was almost secondary. The seams in Pyramiden were never the richest. From a purely economic standpoint, other mines made more sense. But Pyramiden offered something coal alone could not: visibility. It was a symbol that could be pointed to, photographed, described, and remembered. Every detail reinforced that purpose. The cultural center was massive, far larger than necessary for a small Arctic settlement. It included a theater, a cinema, a library, and rehearsal spaces. The sports complex featured a gymnasium and one of the northernmost swimming pools in the world. Even the town square was designed with intention, dominated by a statue of Lenin gazing toward the mountains. Life in Pyramiden followed strict rhythms: work shifts in the mines, scheduled cultural activities in the evenings, organized sports, collective events. The town was isolated, but was never meant to feel lonely. Structure replaced chaos. Routine replaced fear. In an environment where nature constantly reminded people how fragile they were, the system offered order. Yet this carefully maintained balance depended entirely on the Soviet state. Subsidies kept the town alive. Logistics networks delivered supplies regardless of cost. Political will mattered more than profitability. As long as the Soviet Union existed, Pyramiden had a reason to exist. That reason began to erode. In the late 1980s, as the Soviet economy weakened and reforms reshaped priorities, distant, symbolic projects became liabilities. The collapse of the USSR in 1991 was not just political. It was logistical. Funding chains broke. Bureaucracies dissolved. Suddenly, towns like Pyramiden were no longer statements of strength. They were expenses with no clear purpose. But what followed was strange. Pyramiden did not immediately decline into chaos. It did not slowly empty over decades. Instead, it lingered briefly, as if waiting for a decision, and then the decision came swiftly. Operations were shut down. Families were told to leave. Supplies stopped arriving. The experiment was over. What makes this moment unsettling is how little resistance appears to have occurred. No protests, no long struggle to save the town. Paopli packed boarded ships and left behind a fully functioning city. It was not abandonment through neglect. It was abandonment by decree. The Soviet experiment in the Arctic ended not with an explosion or disaster, but with silence. A system that had once poured immense effort into sustaining life here simply withdrew, leaving behind buildings, objects, and memories that no longer served any political purpose. And that raises a deeper question. If Pyramiden was created to prove something, what did its sudden erasure mean? Was it merely a budgetary decision? Or was the town too closely tied to an ideology that no longer wanted reminders of its grand, frozen promises. To understand why Pyramid's abandonment feels so disturbing, you first have to understand how alive this place once was. This was not a rough mining camp clinging to survival. It was a carefully engineered version of normal life, transplanted into one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. For the people who lived here, the Arctic was not a temporary hardship. It was home. Families arrived knowing they would spend years, sometimes decades, above the Arctic Circle. Children were born, Eddie. They went to school here. They learned to ride bicycles under a sky that could remain dark for months at a time. Life adapted to conditions most humans never experience. Daily routines were tightly structured. Miners worked underground in rotating shifts, descending into coal seams carved beneath frozen mountains. The work was dangerous and exhausting, but it was also stable. Employment in Pyramiden was considered prestigious by Soviet standards. Workers earned higher wages than many of their counterparts on the mainland, and those wages came with benefits that made Arctic life not just tolerable, but surprisingly comfortable. Apartments were warm, brightly painted, and fully furnished. Heating was constant. Electricity never failed. Water ran reliably, even in temperatures that could drop far below -30 degrees Celsius. The buildings were designed to maximize light during the brief summer months and compensate psychologically during the long polar night. Large windows, communal spaces, and bright interiors were intentional, not decorative. Food was another anomaly. While many Soviet citizens elsewhere stood in lines for basic supplies, Pyramiden residents ate well. Fresh fruit and vegetables were flown in regularly. Meat, dairy, and bread were abundant. Meals were communal, reinforcing the sense that this was not a frontier outpost, but a functioning town with dignity and care built into daily life. Children attended a well-funded school. They studied standard subjects, but also music, art, and physical education. The cultural center was the heart of the town. It hosted film screenings, concerts, theatrical performances, and holiday celebrations. Sports leagues were active. The swimming pool, heated year-round, became a symbol of pride. Swimming in the Arctic was not a necessity. It was a statement. Social life mattered deeply here because isolation was the real enemy. During winter, when the sun disappeared entirely, the outside world shrank. Blizzards could trap residents indoors for days. Travel was impossible. In those months, the town turned inward. Community events multiplied. Shared routines replaced the natural rhythms people lost without sunlight. Yet even in this environment, there were rules. Pyramiden was controlled. Alcohol was restricted. Behavior was monitored. Residents were expected to participate in community life and maintain discipline. This was not freedom in the romantic sense. It was order, designed to keep people functional, cooperative, and emotionally stable under extreme conditions. Nature, however, was never fully tamed. Polar bears roamed the surrounding land, making it illegal to leave town without a rifle. Avalanches threatened nearby slopes. Ice could shift without warning. Residents lived with constant awareness that outside the town's boundaries, the Arctic remained indifferent to human ambition. That contrast defined life inside the settlement: warmth, culture, and structure. Outside, silence, ice, and danger. The town functioned like a protective bubble, an artificial island of human normalcy held together by logistics, ideology, and continuous support from far away. And this is what makes the abandonment so difficult to process. People did not flee misery. They left behind a life that by many accounts, worked. A life that was stable, organized, and in some ways better than what awaited them elsewhere after the Soviet collapse. When residents departed, they did not just leave buildings, they left routines, friendships, a shared identity forged in one of the harshest environments imaginable. Children who had known nothing else suddenly found themselves relocated to cities that felt chaotic, overcrowded, and uncertain. The silence that followed was not the silence of decay. It was the silence after a conversation abruptly ends. Long before the final ship left Pyramidens harbor, there were signs that the town's future was becoming fragile. They were not dramatic alarms or sudden disasters. They were subtle changes, easy to dismiss at the time, especially in a place where life had always depended on distant decisions and invisible supply lines. In the late 1980s, residents began to notice small disruptions. Supply shipments arrived less frequently. Certain goods that had once been taken for granted became inconsistent. Maintenance schedules stretched longer. Equipment repairs that used to happen immediately were postponed. None of this felt catastrophic on its own, but together they created a quiet sense that something had shifted. Politically, the world that sustained Pyramiden was unraveling. Perestroika and glasnost were transforming the Soviet Union from the inside. State subsidies were being questioned. Projects that existed for ideological reasons rather than pure economic efficiency were suddenly scrutinized. Pyramiden fit that description perfectly. It was expensive, remote, and symbolic. A luxury the collapsing system could no longer justify. Inside the mines, productivity declined. The coal seams were not as profitable as those in other regions of machinery aged. Investment slowed. Safety concerns increased. Mining accidents, while not frequent, reminded everyone that maintaining industrial operations in the Arctic required constant, costly attention. Without guaranteed funding, even small failures could escalate quickly. There were also changes in communication. Residents reported that information from mainland authorities became vague, decisions were delayed, instructions contradicted previous policies. Management itself seemed uncertain. For a town built on strict organization and predictability, this uncertainty was deeply unsettling. Yet daily life continued. Children still went to school. Cultural events still filled the calendar. The swimming pool remained open. On the surface, Pyramiden functioned as it always had. That normalcy may have been the most dangerous illusion of all. When routines stay intact, people assume stability still exists beneath them. Another warning came from demographics. Fewer new families arrived to replace those who left. Positions that once had waiting lists became harder to fill. The town's population began to shrink quietly. It was not a mass exodus, but a slow thinning. A teacher not replaced, a technician transferred and never returned. Each absence slightly weakened the social fabric. Then there was the psychological shift. Pyramiden had always felt permanent to its residents. Suddenly, that confidence eroded. Conversations changed tone. Speculation replaced certainty. People began to ask questions that had never mattered before. What would happen if the mine closed? Where would everyone go? Would the town survive without Moscow's support? These questions had no clear answers, and that absence of answers created tension in a place where survival depended on planning. Uncertainty was a threat equal to cold or isolation. The idea that Pyramiden might not last forced residents to imagine a future outside the protective bubble they had known for years, and yet no one publicly announced the end. There were no town hall meetings explaining a closure timeline, no gradual dismantling, no visible preparations for a mass departure. The warnings remained just that, warnings without resolution. This is what makes the collapse so haunting in retrospect. Pyramiden did not fail loudly. It weakened quietly. By the time the final decision arrived, the foundation had already been hollowed out by forces far beyond the town itself. When the end finally came, it did not arrive as a gradual shutdown. It arrived as a directive. In the late 1990s, residents of Pyramiden were informed that the town would be closed and that they would be leaving. Not someday, not eventually. Soon. For many, the notice felt abrupt. Life had been growing more uncertain. Yes, but few believed the entire settlement would be erased. Pyramiden had survived harsh winters, political shifts, and decades of logistical challenges. The idea that it could simply stop existing still felt unreal. And yet, the decision was final. The official reason was straightforward. Coal mining was no longer economically viable, and maintaining a fully subsidized Arctic town no longer made sense for the post-Soviet state. The mine would close. Support would end. The town would be evicted. What followed was an unusually fast departure. Families packed what they could: essential documents, clothing, personal items, but much was left behind. Furniture, books, records, children's toys, musical instruments. Entire apartments were abandoned with everyday life still visible inside them. This detail is critical. When people flee disaster or conflict, they take everything they can. When communities slowly decline, buildings empty gradually, stripped and scavenged over time. Pyramiden fits neither pattern. The town was not fleeing danger, and it was not dissolving naturally. It was being shut down. Transportation was arranged in stages. Ships arrived to carry people away across icy waters. Each departure reduced the population further, making the town feel increasingly hollow. Schools closed. Cultural events stopped. Services ended one by one. The social heartbeat that had sustained the town for decades simply ceased. For those leaving, the emotional impact was severe. Pyramiden was not just a workplace. It was identity. People had adapted to the Arctic together. They shared routines, isolation, and a sense of purpose that outsiders rarely understood. Leaving meant more than relocation. It meant losing a world that could never be recreated elsewhere. Some residents reportedly had only days to prepare. Others were given slightly more time, but no real choice. The decision had been made far beyond the Arctic, in offices where Pyramiden was a line item rather than a lived reality. Once the order came, resistance was pointless. By 1998, the last inhabitants were gone. What is striking is how deliberately the town was left behind. There was no systematic dismantling, no widespread salvage operation. Infrastructure that could have been reused elsewhere was simply abandoned. Heating systems, cultural buildings, even the swimming pool remained intact. This raises uncomfortable questions. Why not recover valuable equipment? Why not strip the town to reduce losses? The answer may lie in cost, logistics, or indifference. Or it may suggest something else, that Pyramid's purpose had ended so completely that preserving or repurposing it no longer mattered. Once the final ship departed, the Arctic moved in quickly. Cold, wind, and silence reclaimed the streets. Snow drifted into doorways. Darkness returned for months at a time. The town did not collapse. It simply stopped. No ceremony marked the end, no memorial, no acknowledgement of what had been built and lost. Pyramid became a place without people, but full of evidence that people had been there very recently, and that is what continues to unsettle visitors today. The town was not destroyed. It was abandoned with intention. Walking through Pyramiden today feels less like exploring ruins and more like trespassing into a moment that was never meant to be revisited. This is not decay in the traditional sense. It is suspension. Life here did not slowly fade away. It stopped mid-gesture. Inside the apartment blocks, doors hang slightly open. Kitchens still hold plates stacked neatly in cupboards. Pots rest on stoves that were never turned on again. In bedrooms, clothing remains folded in drawers. Shoes wait by doorways, as if someone planned to return after a short walk and simply never did. In the school notebooks sit on desks. Chalk dust still clings faintly to blackboards. Children's drawings line the walls, simple images of houses, animals, bright suns that feel almost cruel in a place where the sun vanishes for months at a time. The silence in these rooms is overwhelming because it contradicts what the objects suggest. These were spaces meant for noise, movement, voices. The cultural center is perhaps the most unsettling of all. Rows of seats in the theater remain perfectly aligned, facing a stage that will never host another performance. Music stands are still upright. Posters from Soviet films and concerts hang faded but intact. It feels as if the audience stepped out during intermission and never returned. In the gymnasium, sports equipment lies abandoned. Basketballs deflated on the floor. Volleyball nets sagging slightly with time. The swimming pool, once heated year-round, now sits empty. Its tiled walls cracked by cold. This was one of the northernmost pools on Earth, a symbol of human defiance against environment, now reduced to a silent shell. Even offices tell stories. Filing cabinets remain filled with documents. Calendars still show dates from the 1990s. Typewriters and early computers sit exactly where they were last used. These are not relics of ancient history. They are artifacts of lives interrupted within living memory. What makes this preservation possible is the Arctic itself. The extreme cold slows decay. Wood rots more slowly. Metal corrodes at a reduced pace. Mold struggles to spread. Nature, usually the force that erases human presence, here acts as a freezer, locking moments in place. But preservation also raises deeper questions. Why was so much left behind? Why were personal items not taken, sold, reused? Why were official records abandoned? In most closures, especially under economic pressure, recovery and salvage follow immediately. Pyramiden was treated differently. Some argued that the logistics were simply too difficult. Transporting heavy furniture, documents, and equipment across Arctic waters would have cost more than they were worth. Others suggest that the speed of the evacuation left little time for careful planning. But neither explanation fully satisfies the scale of what remains. It feels less like neglect and more like abandonment by design. Objects tell us what official statements do not. They reveal that people expected continuity right up until the end. No one packs children's drawings carefully for storage if they believe they are leaving forever. No one leaves instruments behind if they believe the town will never be used again. These things suggest that the finality of the decision may not have been fully understood until it was too late. And there is something else. Leaving objects behind creates a narrative. A frozen town becomes a monument, a reminder. Whether intentional or not, Pyramiden now stands as a physical archive of a vanished system, preserved more clearly than many written records ever could. As you picture these rooms, these objects, and the lives that stopped around them, share this thought if it resonates with you. Do these abandoned belongings feel like carelessness, or do they feel like evidence of a story that was never meant to be fully told? What happened to Pyramiden after the last residents left should have been straightforward. A town closes a mine, shuts down, people relocate, and history moves on. But when you look closer, the official explanations begin to feel thin, fragmented, and strangely incomplete. Publicly, the story has always been simple. The Soviet Union collapsed. Coal prices dropped. The mine was no longer profitable. Maintaining a remote Arctic settlement became too expensive. Therefore, Pyramiden was abandoned. End of story. Yet when former residents, administrators, and researchers speak about those final years, the details rarely align perfectly. Some former workers describe the closure as sudden and poorly explained, with little transparency about long-term plans. Others recall being told that operations were temporarily suspended, not permanently ended. A few believed the town would be mothballed and possibly reactivated later, not erased from daily life entirely. This uncertainty matters. If residents believed Pyramiden might reopen, it explains why so much was left behind. It explains why personal belongings, documents, and infrastructure were not treated as permanently disposable. People do not abandon their lives so completely unless they believe the door is still open. There are also inconsistencies in how responsibility is framed. Some accounts place the decision squarely on economic reality. Others point to political embarrassment. Pyramiden was not just a mining town. It was a Soviet showcase, a symbol built to demonstrate ideological strength in extreme conditions. After the collapse of the USSR, that symbol became uncomfortable, a reminder of promises that could no longer be kept. Maintaining Pyramiden meant maintaining a monument to a system that had failed. Letting it quietly disappear solved that problem without public reckoning. Then there is the issue of documentation. Official records from the final years are incomplete. Reports are missing. Some operational data was never released publicly. Administrative transitions between Soviet, Russian, and company oversight created gaps where accountability dissolved. In those gaps, decisions were made quietly. Even today, access to full archives related to Pyramiden's shutdown is limited. What exists is often fragmented, sanitized, or purely logistical. There is little reflection on the human cost, the cultural impact, or the long-term implications of erasing a functioning community so abruptly. Another layer of contradiction comes from Norway's role. Svalbard is governed by international treaty, and while the Soviet Union had rights to operate there, Norwegian authorities monitored activity, yet official Norwegian narratives also remain restrained. Pyramiden's closure is treated as an economic footnote rather than a historical rupture. No investigation, no public inquiry, no official attempt to preserve the town as a living archive at the moment of abandonment. Silence can be practical. It can also be intentional. By avoiding deeper explanation, responsibility dissolves. There is no single villain, no dramatic failure, no uncomfortable admission that an entire community existed primarily as a political message. When the message lost value, the community lost protection. and so Pyramiden entered a strange historical limbo, too recent to be ancient history, too politically inconvenient to be fully examined, too remote for public pressure. What remains is a town full of evidence, surrounded by narratives that never fully confronted. As you consider these conflicting versions, think about this and share it if you feel compelled. When history is reduced to a simple explanation, what truths are usually being protected, and who benefits from that silence? When Pyramiden was shut down, the building stayed, the objects stayed, but the people were scattered, and their stories became far harder to trace than the town itself. Unlike ruins from ancient times, this was a living community dismantled within modern memory. The psychological impact of that rupture did not end when the ships left the harbor. Most residents were relocated to mainland Russia or Ukraine, often to industrial cities already struggling in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse. For many, the transition was brutal. Pyramiden had been isolated, but it was stable. Jobs were guaranteed. Housing was secure. Community life was structured and predictable. What awaited them was uncertainty, unemployment, overcrowding, and economic chaos. Former residents have described a profound sense of dislocation. In Pyramiden, everyone shared the same environment, the same routines, the same risks that created a bond rarely found elsewhere. Leaving meant losing not just a home, but an identity built around endurance and collective purpose. On the mainland, they became ordinary citizens overnight, often competing for scarce resources in cities unprepared to absorb them. Children were hit especially hard. Many had spent their entire lives above the Arctic Circle. They were used to tight-knit classrooms, familiar faces, and a controlled environment where everyone knew each other. Suddenly, they were placed in large schools, anonymous neighborhoods, and unstable social conditions. Parents struggled to explain why the only world their children had known no longer existed. There was also a quiet sense of betrayal. People had believed in the system that brought them to Pyramiden. They trusted the promises of stability, progress, and purpose. When the system collapsed, it did not just fail abstractly. It failed personally. The town was not destroyed by nature or war. It was abandoned by the very structure that had required their loyalty. Some residents managed to rebuild their lives successfully. Others did not. Accounts speak of depression, alcoholism, fractured families, and long-term trauma linked to the sudden loss of community and meaning. Pyramiden was extreme, but it was coherent. The outside world felt fragmented by comparison. What makes this harder to confront is how invisible these outcomes remain. There were no large-scale studies, no public reckoning, no official acknowledgement that uprooting an entire population from an isolated, purpose-built environment might have long-lasting psychological consequences. The people of Pyramiden simply disappeared into statistics. In interviews conducted years later, some former residents expressed nostalgia that borders on grief. They remember not just the buildings, but the rhythm of life, the shared celebrations, the feeling of being part of something rare. Others refuse to speak about it at all, as if silence is the only way to contain the loss. Pyramiden today is often described as a ghost town, but the real ghosts may be the people who carried it with them, long after leaving the Arctic. The town froze in place. Their lives did not. They were forced to move forward without closure, explanation, or recognition. Pyramiden may appear frozen and peaceful, but it is not a safe place. What remains today is not just silence and abandoned buildings. It is a landscape where danger never left, only changed its form. The most immediate threat is isolation. Pyramiden is still cut off from the world. There are no permanent road connections, no nearby hospitals, no rapid rescue services in winter. Temperatures can drop far below -30 degrees Celsius, and storms can appear without warning. A simple injury here can quickly become life-threatening. Then there are the polar bears. Unlike many ghost towns, Pyramiden was never reclaimed by harmless wildlife. It exists inside the natural territory of one of the planet's most dangerous predators. Polar bears regularly roam through the town. They move silently between buildings, investigate open doors, and leave tracks in the snow that cut through empty streets. For this reason, anyone leaving the settlement perimeter is legally required to carry a rifle. Even today, guides warn visitors that the town is not abandoned by nature. It is watched. The buildings themselves are another threat. Time and cold have weakened structures that were never designed to stand unmaintained for decades. Roofs collapse under snow weight. Floors rot from moisture trapped inside frozen walls. Staircases give way without warning. What looks solid can fail in seconds. Exploration here is not just trespassing into history. It is physical risk. Inside, there are other hazards. Old industrial materials remain untouched. Rusting machinery, broken glass, chemical residues from mining operations, asbestos insulation hidden behind walls. In many places, the town is a sealed time capsule of mid-20th century industrial life, including all the dangers that came with it. The environment amplifies every mistake. Cold slows reaction time. Darkness disorientes. The silence itself becomes unsettling, making it harder to sense movement or danger. Even experienced explorers describe an instinctive unease, the feeling that the town does not want to be approached casually. And yet, people keep coming. Photographers, historians, urban explorers, and tourists are drawn by the same thing that makes Pyramiden dangerous: its authenticity. This place has not been sanitized. It has not been rebuilt into a theme park. It remains raw, exposed, and unforgiving. A reminder that human ambition once tried to impose permanence on an environment that does not negotiate. Norwegian authorities allow limited access, often under strict supervision. A small group maintains a minimal presence, mostly to support tourism and preserve what can be preserved. But the town itself is not restored. It is stabilized, not revived. The goal is not to bring life back, but to prevent complete collapse. This creates a strange tension. Pyramiden is both protected and abandoned, open and forbidden, preserved and decaying. It exists in a narrow balance between memory and danger. Standing there, it becomes clear that the Arctic never forgave human absence. It simply waited. After everything that is known, documented, and officially explained, Pyramiden still refuses to feel resolved. The buildings stand. The objects remain. The silence continues. And yet, the central question has never truly been answered. Was Pyramiden simply an economic casualty of a collapsing system? Or was it something more deliberate? On the surface, the explanation feels reasonable. The Soviet Union fell. Subsidies vanished. Coal lost value. Remote projects became unsustainable. End of story. But when you stand inside a fully intact school or walk through apartments where everyday life stopped without warning, that explanation begins to feel incomplete. Economic failures usually leave chaos behind. Stripped infrastructure, salvaged materials. Signs of desperation. Pyramiden shows restraint, order, almost dignity in its abandonment. That is not how systems behaved when they are merely failing. That is how they behave when a decision is executed cleanly and without emotional attachment. There is also the symbolism. Pyramiden was never just a town. It was a message, a demonstration that ideology could conquer environment, isolation, and nature itself. When that ideology collapsed, the town became an uncomfortable reminder of promises that could no longer be defended. In that context, erasing Pyramiden quietly made sense. No debate, no public reckoning, no memorial for the lives built there. Just silence. Some historians argue that leaving the town intact was not neglect, but convenience. It was easier to walk away than to dismantle something so remote. Others suggest that the town was never meant to be revisited, only forgotten. And then there are those who believe Pyramiden was intentionally preserved as a frozen artifact, whether consciously or not, allowing time itself to archive the experiment without commentary. What makes the mystery linger is that no single explanation fully satisfies all the evidence. Too many decisions happened quietly. Too many records are incomplete. Too many personal accounts describe confusion rather than clarity. And too many objects remain for a town that was supposedly finished. Pyramiden now exists in a strange state. Not alive. Not erased. Not explained. A city without people, but not without meaning. Perhaps that is the true legacy of Pyramiden. Not goal, not ideology, but the reminder that systems can create entire worlds and then abandon them without ceremony when they no longer serve a purpose. Standing in the Arctic wind, surrounded by buildings that once echoed with laughter, music, and routine, the question becomes unavoidable. If a place this complete can be erased so quietly, what else in history has disappeared the same way, without anyone ever fully understanding why? If you stayed with this story until the end, you are already part of a small group that looks beyond surface explanations and wants to understand what history leaves unsaid. Pyramiden is not just an abandoned town. It is a warning, a frozen reminder of how entire communities can vanish when decisions are made far away from the people who live with the consequences. If this story made you question the official version, leave a comment right now and write Pyramiden was not forgotten. I want to know your theory. Do you believe this was only an economic decision? Or do you think something deeper was quietly buried in the Arctic ice? Make sure to leave a like. If this investigation held your attention until the end, it tells the algorithm that long, detailed stories like this deserve to be shared. And if you want more deep dives into abandoned cities, hidden historical crimes, and places the world chose to forget, subscribe to the channel now. There is another story waiting for you on your screen, another mystery connected to power, silence, and forgotten lives. Click on the next video and continue this journey.